Okay, thank you. So on S45, which we've taken quite a bit of testimony, and we don't have anybody else lined up to come in, and I think we're at a point where we have been able to hear, different perspectives. We're, I think, generally comfortable with the idea that one change that we would all like to see from existing law is that if you change the type of farming that you do or change your farming methods, that shouldn't disqualify you. Yeah, or diversify. Right now, that's pretty much like you don't want to qualify for the.
I thought S45 absolutely allows, well, S45 allows it,
Yes.
allows the diversification.
Right. So when I say right now, I'm talking about existing.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
What the statute has right now.
Thank you.
Yeah. So as we try to find things that are in S45 that we can collectively, agree to, that feels like one that we're all, more or less comfortable with. There's also a provision in the draft version that we've been looking at that says if there was farming there in the recent future, farming practice stops, and then it's a 5-year period basically in the bill that we've got right now. It says that if you take a temporary pause, that shouldn't disqualify you. And I don't know whether that's clear under existing law or not, but this would make it explicit anyway. Representative Baird.
You think we could look at ways of, I know, like listening to testimony from Justin Rich yesterday, does make a good point that, starting out as a new farmer fund, there's quite a few fields that have been abandoned in Vermont for well over 10 years. It used to be, of course, farms. I'm wondering if there could be a process where somebody coming in on land that's. Were you saying we were talking about another state, I believe, where there isn't a cap on the time for how long it's been since the land was farmed? I want to bring. I can't remember the details of that, but if there are any other states that do that. The only reason why, maybe there could be a process of, maybe an application that could be put in or something where the neighboring properties say, I'd like to, acknowledge that this land is being put back into farming and I'm agreeable with that. Something along those lines, because if we're gonna, we've got proposals like 30 by 30 in terms of food production. Well, we gotta have more land recovered by farmers, or we're gonna, as our populations grow, and if we're gonna meet the economic needs of our state, then there will have to be land that's currently just straight woods right now that potentially be put back in the field for the sake of farming. This either we let those farms not be protected under this statute, or is there a way to say if it's a farm that's been active for 5 years, then it is automatically rolled into these protections? You know what I'm saying? So if they go 5 years and nobody, and they won't have the protection for 5 years on new ground. But then once they get past 5 years, they're considered farmland again.
So there's.
Or how is that in here? Is that a possibility?
Well, I don't think it's in here, but anything's a possibility, up to a point. But are you suggesting then that if a new farm or a farm that hasn't been farmed for a long time, but somebody comes in, there's sort of a 5-year period where neighbors could complain?
Sure. But if they get past those 5 years, then they are grandfathered into this program. At that point, they've been farming for 5 years, the neighbors around them, if they're continuing to farm, that would suggest whatever, maybe there's some sort of process there that we go through, but making sure those new farms can enjoy the same benefits of every other farm.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
I just see, I know I feel like this is good statute in terms of bringing more clarity to the relationship between neighbors and farms personally. And, as new farms go in, there's going to be more neighbors surrounding these new farms who aren't used to farming potentially, but I think if we have a good statute that is good for neighbors and good for farms, then making sure new farms can also, because I don't know how that's going to fit in anyway, if it's with new farms going in, it doesn't really address that. The current statute definitely only addresses farms that have been there and existing. Even S45, I'd have to see, does it address new farms that go in? At what point would they be considered?
yeah, I think it's not quite as explicit. And when we think about the fact that at some point in Vermont's settled past, so much of the land was cleared. Right?
8%.
Yeah, and now, so much of that is, you would never know, right, unless you saw the stone walls and what's happening here. But in even if we just looked at land that was, sitting at fallow, that hadn't been farmed for, nothing much had been done with it, maybe it had been mown, that feels like, okay, that maybe we want to consider that. Is there a difference if that land is in one type of community versus another type of community? Because part of the existing interpretation, I think, of when a nuisance might be a nuisance or not is whether it would be whether a typical person, that's not the right legal term, would consider it to be a problem or not. And if I were your neighbor, or on, somewhere in your farm, you would say, well, yeah, you would expect that there's going to be farm smells and farm noises and so forth. But that might not be the case if you were in a village somewhere. So yeah, this is where I think we can get Mike maybe to help us think through how we might distinguish that. But it does feel like we might want to expand this even further, I think, than what's in the draft that we've been looking at to envision what if it's not a farm, what if it's not being farmed, and what if it hasn't being farmed for quite a few years?
I mean, I can attest to that. I mean, I've actually, in our sugaring operation, that's been more the case where we've gone into woods that hasn't been sugared for years. And we put out new tubing and cut down some trees. And on one woods, I got a neighbor that called me up and said she was disappointed with the number of trees that we cut out. And that, it used to be a prime habitat for, whatever wildlife she was concerned about. And I said, I understand where you're coming from. But I purchased the land as a farmer. I've got, my parents are elderly. I have to support them. We can't be on the same acreage that we used to, and all our farm supports about 7 families now, and so, for me to leave that woods untouched like it was, doesn't support our families, and so, yes, I did alter what was out there, but it's not, I think it's a happy medium in terms of, I could have sold those off as house lots, and she would have had more houses beside her. She had a great offer to her house from the edge of my land. That's not an issue, but she was just concerned about wildlife.
Visiting companies.
Now, that doesn't have to do with nuisance, but it starts to, and then she also thought I tapped some trees on her side, and I'm the one who strung, So there's those neighbors that are there, and she went out and realized that I hadn't, and I was willing to walk the lines with her, but if I, a step further, you can see how those little bit of rough relationships lead to something more, right? And a lot of it's just because I came in and did something different.
Yeah.
Now, where my SAF tanks are, the neighbor that's there loves what we're doing. He's like, I love seeing somebody do something, like, So it's like, it's a mixed bag, but so. It is a, you know, there's a constant having to work with neighbors on doing something new and different.
Yeah.
On land. So I think that it's, you know, I don't. Obviously, you know, because that gets a little complicated, you know, this is a parcel that we didn't own before, but we have had this business for a number of years. Am I covered only on certain parcels with this statute? And when I buy new ones, new sugar woods that haven't been sugared in, who knows, over 50 years? You know, am I covered on that one parcel, but not on this one?
Have some language that could be inserted if the land can be. So our bill says 5 years, this bill, the bill in House Judiciary that I brought says 10 years. Because the CRP Cropland Reserve Program is like an 8 to 10 year rollout. You know, it sits fallow for that long. And so, and I drive by a lot of fields that have not been used for years. And not that I'm gonna use them, you know, if it was to my scale, we'd have it. But for somebody for a 10-acre vegetable deal, it's perfect. But maybe we could put in something about if the land is suitable for agriculture, be it silviculture, you know, the maple sugar industry or any other type of farming. It meets the requirements of A&R, because if you put land in agriculture that's been out for a long time, you have to check out with A&R to make sure you're not devastating, you know, wetland or something.
So maybe maybe there's a way to write something that,
Amendable.
Yeah.
Malleable.
okay, all right, good, well, yeah.
Why is there a 5 or 10 year thing anyway? I mean, can it, if we say any neighbor, you know, if I'm a farmer, I start farming and
So
I'm following the RAPs, it seems like so much of this is just sort of neighbor and neighbor relationships, or good neighbor and good neighbor relationships. So it seems,
Yeah,
and if I put up a high tunnel and, you know, 1 acre in my back lawn, it's been
so
a back lawn in Colchester.
the existing, under existing law, it's not, it may be a little vague, but it seems to be saying this rebuttable presumption, this right that you have only applies if you were farming before the neighbor got there. So I think that 5-year thing is maybe just an attempt to find a common or a compromise between not at all and, you know, forever kind of a thing. So
But do we need a compromise?
maybe not. Yeah. I mean, maybe there is a perspective that we do, but
Well, I mean, this is when it starts getting tricky then, if you think about all the possible scenarios and, you know, you're next door, you know, you live in a house and there's a house next door and they want to start a pig farm. And their pig farm is like 100 yards from your back door. Well, a pig farm is going to be a lot stinkier than a lot of other kinds of farms. You know, do we want to say that any farmer who wants to have any kind of business can open at any place? I don't know that we do. I mean, I think trying to support people engaging in farming to produce food for people in Vermont is good, but do we, I mean, I don't know, to legislate like what's okay, what's not okay in an open-ended way is really tricky, because I think there are cases where it's not appropriate to build something. I mean, yeah, we've heard some examples where proximity has really been problematic with livestock next to somebody's house. But in general, are there other cases where it can work? Probably. So I don't know how we can address
you know,
that.
I don't know how municipal zoning restrictions might play in here. But
Right.
if currently we allow a town, a municipality to say you can't farm here, you can only farm here. And I have to be honest, I'm not sure how that looks. So we would need to have somebody talk to us about that. Well, maybe the select board member Something about it, but
Well, I could comment.
yeah, please.
In my town, we have zoning. We have areas that are just considered just residential. Out where I live, it's called residential agricultural. It's got to have a 10-acre lot to build a house on. But you can also have agriculture because it's zoned that way. So anybody that comes and buys a house or builds a house out in that area must realize that it's also agricultural. And there are several farms there. We've got a big dairy farm, right? My neighbors, just another neighbor up the road, we've got a big beef farm. But everybody accepts it because they knew when they came there, the attorney would have done the work and, but out in the village area, it's village, it's urban, it's not agricultural.
Representative O'Brien.
So what happens if I want to have 100 chickens in the just residential zoning? The municipality can tell me no.
I'm not sure, but I think the state has something to say there. I believe an individual can still have animals, but I don't know if, at what point does it become an agricultural
Right, yeah.
farm?
Yeah.
I can't answer that.
So in the town of Derby, we farm right in the middle of town. And the farm was there forever. And we bought the farm and we tore down some old buildings and made it modern, 1978 modern. And the select board, the deal was made that as long as there were cows there, it stayed a dairy farm. If it was ever emptied out, it was never to be filled up again. We tore down 2 remaining old buildings and they're not to be rebuilt. So we have the main structure and that can stay there and it can stay a farm. If we ever, it was a deal made with the select board way back.
But in our town, we have 11,000 people. So, and a lot of it is centralized in the village. So just that wouldn't work.
Yeah, well, if that farm was there back in the 50s, the village would have grown up around it.
And there were farms back then, and you're right. But
But eventually they caved into the $40,000 building lot.
So, Representative Butler.
Yeah, so if we pass a right to farm bill, does our state law then supersede that? So if he wants to, open a handicraft store in the middle of his old barn, but if he's growing vegetables in the back, then he could do it because he's still being a farmer or not?
So what our thing says cows. It doesn't say anything about the cropland. It says cows.
Right, but if we have right to farm, you as a farmer could change it. That's what our policy is,
don't-
right?
I don't know if we could. I don't think that's a question for O'Grady. Does this?
Yeah.
So what, just to step back for a second. What we're talking about here is related to nuisance. So and it's why I again want to caution that I feel the right to farm terminology is confusing and somewhat misdirecting. We wouldn't be doing anything in this bill that says you can now plant where a town has told you couldn't plant corn before.
But it said we could, doesn't part of this bill that we're looking at say that you can change and nobody can complain if you change?
It says that changing wouldn't exempt you from being able to still say, I am not creating a nuisance. So it's all relative to creating a nuisance. We'll get to that in a second.
Let's stick to the nuisance.
Okay, it's confusing.
Well, it is confusing, yes, right. So we have an existing law that says, we have existing common law that says you can't create a nuisance to your neighbor. And we have in Vermont and in other laws, what we call the right to farm law that says farmers have an exemption. So you can create a nuisance. And your neighbor can complain, but he can't sue.
Mhm.
The changes that we're, I think, considering here would make it clearer and perhaps easier for the farmer to assert the existing right that they have to be able to create a nuisance. But it would not be saying you can now do things in your farm that other laws currently prevent you from doing, whether they're municipal laws or other state laws. So it's really strictly about what can you do that your neighbor can't complain about, that are, nuisance related. So to that point, though, I want to shift to this question about trespass, because that was in the original bill that came over from the Senate. The House stripped it out and then made some attempt to try and accommodate different perspectives there by sort of putting it back in. I want to see whether we have any sort of consensus on being clearer that this is only about nuisance. It's not about trespass. It's not about allowing water in an excessive way, in a non-normal climate weather way, to be diverted onto a neighbor's property or anything else. I mean, not just water, sewage, anything else like that. Go back to, this is just nuisance. We're not going to try and finesse that. How are people feeling about that?
So the way I understand it, and again, I'd ask Ledge Council.
Yeah.
And others to tell me if I'm understanding it right. Sorry. If water is flowing where water flows, ditches and whatnot, and streams, and water goes where water goes, I cannot create a new waterway and force my neighbor to receive it. That's how I understand it. And I would think that the farming community ought to realize that that's acceptable. But that's how I understand it. If I understand it right.
Yeah, and I think we should ask Mike when he's here to, respond to that and see if you're thinking the same way.
They allowed for dust and odor and whatnot. Yeah, there's allowance for that, but it's the water. And the professor from Vermont Law School explained that so eloquently to us, and I really understood it well. And then I believe it was Jed that spoke to it about, he had some term for it, when towns put in a culvert and the water course is created because of the town putting in a culvert. That the towns, they've been there for 20 years, they become something. He had a term for it. I can't remember what it was.
Representative.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yes, and let's have Mike talk about that. Somebody else said that?
Well, and the opposite is true too. You can't make a pond and where a stream that went through your land, ran into the neighbors, you can't block that stream.
You gotta allow. You have an obligation to receive the rain, and you have an obligation to let it go, and your neighbor has an obligation to receive it and an obligation to let it go. In this, on page, I think it's in two places. It's on page 7. And again, maybe back before that. But anyways, there's alternatives 1 and alternative 2. And those make exception. One is for a 25-year flood event. The other one is for caused by a flood event with an annual exceedance probability of 4% or lower. So think what we talked about in Act 60, the security, the microburst. And I like alternative 2 because that broader protection for those microbursts and whatnot, and not a statewide disaster, but.
So there's 2 places where there's alternative language offered, and that was where they left it in judiciary. So it was left, hanging temporarily. I. We can have Mike offer his legal perspective on this too. I think possibly if we're simply dealing with nuisance here, that we don't even need to be considering either of these options.
Okay.
That if the understanding is if there's a heavy rainfall, there's a heavy rainfall and water flows downhill. And nobody is going to be held liable for that. But I think we want to just be sure that we're,
As long as you are following the RAPS.
well, as long as you are following the RAPS is in here. Yep, yep. So there's subtleties here, right? We want to be sure that we're clear on what we're talking about. Yeah.
You're being a responsible landowner, land manager.
And then my understanding is that even if you are following the RAPS, you get an event, like a 25-year event, and then there's basically we're saying you're no longer held liable for that because it's above and beyond your control, even if you're doing the RAPS. Is that correct?
I think that's, yeah,
Isn't that the idea?
yeah. I mean, we might have, you know,
That's another question, obviously, to clarify.
yeah. But we might have lots of 25-year rain events within a course of 25 years too. So this is,
But at the same time, at what point do you say, what's a person supposed to do
yeah.
then? Right.
Representative O'Brien.
I was just gonna say, like, there already is existing law, common law probably on trespass to begin with, and that sort of neighborly dispute, so I'm not sure. I mean, I'm in favor of striking out you get an exemption for trespass if you farm. That just seems going too far.
I think that's what we were all sort of coalescing around. Yeah, yeah. That we're on board with certainly existing nuisance protection and clarifying that and expanding it to the extent that if you are, I mean, maybe within some limits, want to change the type of operation you do, that's okay. That should be okay. I pointed to you because you mentioned the smelly hog farm.
Right, I just don't know how we define that, so, yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask-
Or the big farm that might be, yeah.
They seem like two very different things too in common law, so to put sort of trespass, tuck it into what we're defining under nuisance seems a problem.
I think that's a problem. Yeah, so I'm posing the question here that we go back to, we just remove all that language and just continue to use the existing common law definition. And rather to try and redefine it. So the other topic I just wanted to run by people was so we have, this gets very technical in legal sense, the very beginning is a rebuttable presumption, which is understood to mean that the farmer has his protection, but that the neighbor can rebut it if certain conditions are met. But then even further, there's this list of conditions that the farmer has to meet, qualifying, being consistent with the RAPS, not changing their farming type. And the burden right now is apparently, in the legal sense here, is on the farmer to prove that. So I think another major step that the bill would take, all versions of the bill, would be to shift that burden onto the plaintiff, onto the neighbor. So that the neighbor then would have to demonstrate that the farm was not following the pesticide rules or not following the RAPS or creating such a noxious and offensive problem that it was, above and beyond. So that's the other thing I would is, how do we feel about that? And that would be a change to the existing law.
I really like to enjoy what everyone else gets to enjoy, is that you're innocent until proven guilty. and that's a non-rebuttable presumption. And then, but you have to follow the rules. You have to be in compliance of your RAPs, you have to be in compliance of your, if you're LFO, MFO, or a certified small farm, you have to be in compliance with that. You have to be in compliance with acceptable ag practices. To have that non-rebuttable presumption. I'm not gonna term it right, but you have to meet these to have that. Now, if you're out there spreading all your manure on the same field, instead of where your nutrient management plan says it should go, well, you're not following the RAPs, you've lost your. And there's nothing in this bill that says you can't sue. You go to mediation first and then arbitration. But if that doesn't work, you can go to court. Absolutely. Nothing in here says you might not end up in court.
Is there anything in the RAP right now that considers sort of nuisance? I mean, a lot of it, like some of it's illegal, like all the pesticide use, you can't, let your pesticides.
I don't think it considers nuisance because that's a civil. Nuisance is a civil issue and the RAPs are like, it's just statutory, what you can do,
But they, in some
Regulatory-wise.
indirect way, maybe do they consider like dust or odors, as far as mitigation
Yeah.
or just control of them so that we don't
Yeah.
have these
Yeah,
nuisance problems?
Yeah, I'll have to ask.
It didn't happen to me last year, but 2 years ago, the guy that used to spray our corn, someone had filed a complaint of drift. And Shane kept impeccable records, wind speed, time he sprayed, wind speed and whatnot, and direction. And the woman claimed that we had drift. And Shane was spraying and the wind was out of the south at 3 miles an hour. And he was spraying to the north of her property with a tremendous buffer between the two properties. But as soon as she called Department of Ag, the Agency of Agriculture, the inspector was on the farm checking the records. A report was filed, a report was followed, and it was not valid. But they were there immediately. Like within 24 hours of getting a phone call, they were there. And that's how that works. We have to keep extensive records and we have to keep extensive records with our nutrient application as well. For what it's worth.
You just mentioned the mediation. So new section, a section that's new, that would be new to statute says that before you file suit, you need to mediation. And I think we've heard some testimony, or maybe I just read this, that generally speaking, the courts expect you to try that anyway, but this would make it explicit. I think we also have heard that the USDA offers, or has historically offered, a free mediation service so that it wouldn't be a cost borne by either party.
Richard's mentioned arbitration. Is there any language on that in there?
There is right after mediation, you read down.
May agree to,
If both
Yeah.
parties are amenable, they can enter arbitration and abide by it potentially.
parties may agree to submit the issue or dispute to binding arbitration.
Yeah.
And she'll share the cost.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And I think that would be something that they would have to pay. So, Representative Burke.
Just looking here at, well, first of all, I think it's personally, I mean, you mentioned that most courts would make sure you went through some process of mediation beforehand, but I think I don't see that, anything negative about putting it into the statute itself. I think it's a good idea, but I was just looking at, maybe I'll have an answer to this instead of asking, but I guess. Council agreed as well, but a change of, you know, it's listing the things that cannot, like, you know, an agricultural activity shall not lose the nuisance or trespass protection. If, you know, a change of ownership or cessation of operation whole or in part, in here has about more than 5 years. Change of crops produced. I'm wondering, like in my, you know, in the case I gave earlier of going from basically just a forest under a forestry plan to sugaring. You know, this isn't really addressing that, where you're going from forestry to really, it's not another form of forestry at that point, it's a form of agriculture. I'm wondering if, you know, the committee thinks that that is another area that where nuisance protection should also.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually see that as going back to the conversation that yes, if somehow we can establish where it might not be appropriate in some areas, but yeah, even if it hasn't been farmed in a century or maybe ever, arguably, if it's land that's suitable and if it's in a place that seems appropriate, could we also give it that protection?
Right, and maybe just, because I still have to follow a forestry management plan with our sugaring operation in order to stay in our current use.
Yeah.
So maybe that would be the requirement instead of RAPs, to be like, that as long as you are following a forestry management plan.
Are you talking for maple sugar production or?
I mean, if this is gonna cover forestry in general too, you know,
It's not covering forestry in general, they have AMPs.
this is really,
But
this is
it does
pertaining to
cover,
agriculture when you.
it covers sugar, yeah.
In this case, say Greg is leasing that land to Sugar Ron. Who's the suit aimed at? Is it the farmer or is it the landowner? If I'm a neighbor and I'm saying, oh, you property owner let Greg change this wildlife habitat that I loved and now I can't enjoy my land.
Yeah, I think the existing law is the farm, so whoever's conducting the agricultural activity.
So it'd be Greg.
Yeah.
That's a good question, though, generally speaking, to ask.
Yeah.
Whether it's a field or woods.
Right, yeah, there's the owner, yeah. All right, so I mean, I think those are the key areas here, and if we. Yeah, so. I think we don't want to lose sight of the fact that. We're talking about expanding the right for one group of people at the expense of another group of people. That other group of people being the neighbors right now. Neighbors in the future. And that sometimes those neighbors are farmers. We've certainly heard that kind of testimony, and that's helpful to think about it, perhaps. But we've heard that there's lots of concern. We haven't heard, because there haven't been a lot of actual lawsuits filed. So I'm just going to mention that again. But if we're, you know, if we want to be responsive to the concerns that we have heard, how can we do that in a way that is, you know, meaningful, but also doesn't go too far to the extent that, as you know, was mentioned earlier, we end up with a type of operation that nobody would want, and we would look back and say, oh, we didn't want to do that. So I think when we have Mike, and it might not be till after lunch now, unless he shows up, but we can, you know, ask him to reflect on that, see if there's something he can do with that. Otherwise, I feel like, you know, we're making some progress, and we've got some areas where we might have some agreement on. If that's all, we could break now, have lunch and uh, come back at 1, and I don't imagine we'll be here for too long. But I think it might be good while we're here if we can make some progress. I did tell Judiciary Committee that we've done taking testimony, we're going to have conversation today, and we would try and have something to them in a formal way in middle of next week.
And they'll move it out.
I think if we get them something where we have broad agreement on, that they're more likely to do something with it. Yeah, if we don't, then I don't